She was sold under God's name, and no one dared to speak until the graves started screaming. In the searing summer of 1872, deep in Selma County, Alabama, a story unfolded that would become one of the most disturbing true stories in American history. Beneath the magnolia blossoms and the hymn-sweetened air, a dark religious horror festered in silence, concealed beneath sermons and sanctified lies. This isn't just Southern Gothic, it's real American history, swallowed by shadows and stitched shut by fear. At the centre of it all stood Clara May Whitlow, just 16, trembling in a faded blue dress, while men cloaked in scripture came not to preach, but to purchase. This was a place where daughters were debts, and scripture was currency. What happened on that land was not just abuse, it was spiritual trafficking, a term too modern to save those already buried. And when the truth clawed its way back to the surface decades later, the soil would speak for the girls whose voices were taken. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is a true story buried in America's forgotten faith crimes. In the blistering heat of a July morning in 1872, the air in Selma County, Alabama hung thick with something unspeakable, not just the smell of sun-baked clay and sweat, but the weight of secrets buried alive. The Whitlow estate sat at the edge of the cotton fields, like a tomb dressed in white paint, its chapel rising just 30 feet behind the main house, a holy place with unholy purpose. Locals whispered that Reverend Silas's daughters never left the grounds, that they were kept close for the Lord's will, but no one dared to ask why the girls never spoke, or why the mother, Margaret Ann, hadn't been seen since spring. It wasn't just a family, it was a sanctified prison. Visitors were rare, and questions even rarer. But everything shifted the moment Jonathan Hale, a young reporter from Montgomery with a battered notebook and too many convictions, stepped off his carriage and into the thick silence of the Whitlow land. He wasn't just chasing a story. He was about to walk straight into one of the darkest chapters of forgotten American history. And it all began with a glance, a silent plea from the girl behind the glass. They called it holy ground until someone found the bone. In the summer of 1872, just outside Selma, Alabama, a barefoot boy chasing a rabbit behind the old Whitlow chapel tripped over what he thought was a tree root. But it wasn't a root. It was a small, sun-bleached femur, still wrapped in the remnants of a burial cloth no wider than a dinner napkin. Locals whispered for years that strange things happened near the chapel, but no one expected a child's bone to rise from the dirt, especially not from land belonging to Reverend Silas Whitlow, a man praised in church and feared in silence. The sheriff dismissed it as a graveyard shift from the rainy season, but no official records ever marked that hill as sacred ground. So why were there bones beneath it? The church called it a misunderstanding, a fluke of erosion, nothing more. But the townspeople stopped walking past the Whitlow property after sundown. What else was buried behind the chapel, and who put it there? No one had answers. Not yet. But one thing was certain, the land had started to speak. And somewhere behind the chapel window, a girl watched without blinking. She appeared every day at 3:17, never before, never after. For nearly 4 months, townsfolk who passed the Whitlow estate at the same hour swore they saw the same girl behind the upper window of the chapel's east wing. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She just stood there, hands pressed against the glass. hair the colour of corn silk, eyes too still to be alive but too haunted to be forgotten. Some said she was a ghost. Others whispered she was the Reverend's daughter, punished for sins she didn't commit. But no one knocked. No one asked. Because Reverend Silas Whitlow was not a man you questioned, not in 1872, and certainly not in Alabama. He held baptisms that felt more like drownings, delivered sermons that could make the air go cold, and ran his household like a divine court where women were silence-bound and boys vanished after dark. So when the girl behind the glass began mouthing something just once, on the third Sunday of July, an old woman crossing the road stopped in her tracks. "Help," she whispered. "Help us." But by the time she told anyone what she saw, the window was empty, and the chapel door had been locked for days. The chapel rang once at midnight, and no one was inside. Locals said the bell hadn't worked in decades. Its rope frayed, and its yoke rusted solid. Yet on the first night of August 1872, a single, hollow toll echoed across the cotton fields of Selma County, slicing through the still air like a warning no one wanted to hear. It came without wind, without footsteps, and without explanation. Farmers left their porches, hounds stopped barking, even the insects went quiet. The next morning, the chapel looked unchanged, still boarded at the back, still draped in creeping moss, but a new scratch had appeared on the heavy oak doors, a vertical line, carved deep, like someone trapped inside had been trying to mark time. Beneath it, pressed into the dirt, was a child's handprint too small for any of Reverend Silas's known daughters. Sheriff Aldridge called it prank hysteria, but people stopped coming near the Whitlow land altogether. Even the mailman began leaving deliveries half a mile down the road. And still, every midnight that followed, the bell rang once, never twice, never thrice. Just once, as if to say, "I'm still here, I'm not done." And the girl in the window. She hadn't blinked in days. He thought he came for a story, but the story had already chosen him. When Jonathan Hale stepped off the dust-coated carriage and onto the cracked red earth of Selma County, he didn't know the ground beneath him had already whispered his name. A young journalist chasing a whisper of corruption in a backwoods parish. He carried nothing but a leather notebook, a fountain pen, and the conviction that truth, even buried, will always rot its way to the surface. But from the moment he laid eyes on the Whitlow Chapel, he felt it the way silence stuck to your skin like humidity, the way the birds stopped singing 30 feet from the steeple. He hadn't yet seen the girl behind the window. He hadn't yet read the name carved into the pew, but the land had been waiting. And soon it would speak to him. The first thing he noticed wasn't the chapel. It was the silence that swallowed it. As Jonathan Hale walked the narrow path toward the Whitlow estate, he expected the usual cicadas droning, dogs barking, wind stirring the tall grass. But there was none of that. Just a stillness so unnatural it pressed against his eardrums like pressure before a storm. The house came into view slowly, as if the land itself was reluctant to reveal it. White paint peeled in long strips from the siding, and the chapel behind it leaned ever so slightly to the left as though time itself was trying to pull it down. Jonathan raised his camera for a quick sketch photo, but the frame refused to focus. Blurry, warped. He blamed the heat at first, but then, behind the chapel's upper window, he saw her. Not clearly, just a flicker, a shape, a pale face. maybe gone before he could blink. Still, something compelled him forward. A man claiming to be the groundskeeper emerged from the shadows of the porch. Eyes too tired for his age. Lips chapped like they hadn't spoken truth in years. "Ain't nothing here worth writing," he said, but wouldn't meet Jonathan's eyes. That was the first lie. And the land knew it. He asked for a tour, and they gave him a sermon. When Jonathan stepped across the warped threshold of the Whitlow Chapel, the air changed. It wasn't just musty, it was thick, almost damp, like something exhaled after years of holding its breath. Pews were bolted to the floor, each one marked with names carved by hand. Not initials, but full names first and middle only. No last names. No dates. The altar was draped in crimson cloth, and above it a cross fashioned from twisted iron, not wood, cast a crooked shadow that seemed to move even when nothing else did. Reverend Silas appeared without warning, tall and dry-voiced, offering no handshake. "Truth," he said, "is not something the living are always meant to carry." He walked Jonathan through the chapel, but not the back rooms, not the cellar. He quoted scripture, but never looked at the Bible. His eyes drifted too often to the east wall, where dust covered a boarded door, and where Jonathan swore he heard a soft knock from the other side. A single knock. Then silence. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. The Reverend smiled, but something behind that wall had moved first. She wasn't supposed to speak, but her eyes begged him to remember. As Jonathan was led through the narrow hallway between the chapel and the main house, the air felt colder, not from weather, but presence, like the walls themselves were watching. A creak on the staircase made him pause, and when he glanced up, he saw her. A girl, no older than 16, standing halfway up the steps in a pale nightdress, barefoot, with bruises barely faded beneath her collarbone. Her hair was stringy, eyes too wide, like she'd been waiting for someone who never came. She didn't speak. She didn't smile, but she reached up slowly and pressed her fingers to her lips, then pointed toward the chapel door behind him. A warning, maybe, or a secret. Before he could say anything, the housekeeper appeared, rigid and breathless, and ushered the girl away with a grip too tight to be maternal. "That's Mary," she muttered, forcing a smile. "One of the Reverend's blessed. The word burned in Jonathan's notebook. That night, when he returned to the inn and opened his satchel, he found something tucked inside that hadn't been there before, a scrap of parchment with a single word scrawled in red ink downstairs. The truth didn't scream, it whispered, from beneath the floorboards. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. The girl's eyes haunted him. The paper in his bag felt heavier than it should. And something inside him, something primal, knew the story wasn't in the chapel's sermons, but in the shadows they refused to show. So the next morning, he returned alone, and this time, he found the cellar. The stairs didn't creak, they moaned, like they didn't want him down there. Jonathan waited until the sun sat high enough to keep suspicion low, then returned to the Whitlow Chapel under the guise of needing one more quote. But this time, no one greeted him. The porch was empty. The door was unlocked. He moved quickly, retracing the hallway, passing the pews that now looked darker somehow, more swollen with secrets. In the corner behind the pulpit, tucked behind a faded tapestry, was the door. Small, splintered, unlocked. As he opened it, a gust of cold, dry air rose up, air that had not touched sunlight in decades. He descended slowly, each step sounding less like wood and more like breath. The cellar was deeper than expected. The stone walls carved with markings he couldn't recognize, some biblical, others more primal. And then he heard it, a faint whimper. Not ghostly, human, muffled, close. He called out. Once. No answer, but the whimper turned into a sob. Then silence. Then a soft scrape against stone, just to his left. He wasn't alone. And whatever else was down there knew he wasn't supposed to be. Chains don't lie, especially when they're still warm. Jonathan turned toward the sound, his breath caught between disbelief and dread. The cellar widened into a narrow corridor, barely lit by a single flickering oil lamp, hung low on a hook. The smell was thick iron, mould, and something fouler, something that had been hidden too long. He moved closer, each footstep echoing off the stone like a countdown. On the far wall, behind a collapsed wooden partition, he found them. Shackles, real ones, bolted to the stone. One still held a frayed rope, the other had something worse, a streak of blood not yet dry. He reached to photograph it, but the second he raised his camera, it powered off. Dead. Fully charged that morning. He checked his watch, stopped. The notebook in his pocket, pages damp, ink bleeding through like sweat. He wasn't imagining it. This was a place meant to erase people, not save them. Then footsteps above, slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was in the chapel. Someone who knew he had found the cellar, and they had just locked the front door. He didn't just find a secret, he became part of it. Jonathan's heart pounded as he backed into the shadows, praying the lamp's flame didn't flicker too loudly. Above him, the footsteps circled, first slow, then suddenly still. Silence followed, thick as fog. Then, without warning, the cellar door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed everything. Jonathan's fingers fumbled for his penlight, the only thing still working. When it flicked on, he wasn't alone. At the far end of the cellar, just beyond the iron shackles, stood a figure, small, shaking. It was Mary, the girl. Her lips were bloodied, eyes swollen but focused. She didn't speak, just pointed to the corner behind him. He turned, and what he saw shouldn't have been there. A second passageway, narrow, crude, dug by hand. Inside it, walls etched with dozens of names, the same ones carved into the chapel pews. Not memorials, not dedications, victims. Jonathan was breathing too loud now, and Mary motioned sharply quiet. Then she mouthed a single word, "Run," but it was too late. Behind them, the stone wall groaned open, and from the darkness, a voice that didn't belong to any living man whispered, "You were not invited." Some truths don't just haunt, they hunt. The deeper Jonathan went, the more he realized this wasn't just a cellar. It was a tomb with moving walls and a memory that refused to forget. What started as whispers became footsteps. What felt like escape became entrapment. And now, with every breath, he was getting closer to what the chapel was built to protect. They didn't bury the dead, they kept them listening. Jonathan and Mary ducked into the narrow passage, lungs burning with panic, the stone closing behind them as if the chapel itself had swallowed them whole. But what lay ahead shattered logic. The tunnel opened into a hidden chamber lined with pews. Underground, facing a pulpit made of bone. Behind that altar stood a wall of plaster, cracked and pulsing like it was breathing. And on it, ears. Human ears. Hundreds of them. Dried and embedded into the surface like trophies. Or worse, witnesses. In the centre of the floor, a circle of ash surrounded what looked like a journal. But when Jonathan picked it up, it wasn't a journal at all, it was a ledger. Names, dates, sins. Every person who had entered the chapel and never left. His name was already there, written in red. So was Mary's. The last entry was blank, but the ink was still wet. That meant someone had just been added. Someone else was down here, watching. And they knew he could read. They didn't worship God, they worshipped memory. As Jonathan turned the final page of the ledger, a sheet fell loose, brittle and yellowed with time. It wasn't a confession. It was a blueprint. The chapel above was just a shell. The real structure was beneath. A mirrored cathedral designed to trap sound, preserve echoes, and record sins in silence. Every sermon wasn't for redemption. It was a chant, a trigger, a ritual disguised as worship. The ears on the wall weren't just grotesque, they were functional, preserved with ancient resin. They had been wired through the stone, creating an underground archive of suffering. Mary stepped forward, touching one of the ears, and flinched. A scream surged through the chamber, loud and raw, but no one had spoken. It came from the wall. It was a child's voice, begging. Then another, older, pleading for forgiveness. Then silence again. Jonathan backed away, dizzy, nauseous. Every sound in that room had been kept alive, looping, layered like a choir of the damned. He wasn't hearing echoes. He was hearing the dead remember themselves. It wasn't just a church. It was a recorder of pain. As Jonathan stumbled backward, he noticed something carved deep into the pulpit's underside, a name he recognized. His brother's. The one who vanished 5 years ago without a trace. The one everyone said had run away. But here, etched in bone and dust, was proof that he had been here and never left. Jonathan's knees buckled. The ledger hadn't lied. This wasn't just a place of worship. It was a prison of remembrance, a sanctuary for the silenced. He turned to Mary, but her face had gone pale, eyes wide, fixed on something behind him. Slowly, he turned to and froze. Standing in the far corner, barely visible in the flickering light, was a man in a preacher's robe, but his mouth was sewn shut. And yet, he was humming. The sound vibrated through the chamber, not from voice, but from the walls themselves. Mary whispered, trembling. He was the first, and now he chooses the last. At that moment, Jonathan realized they hadn't discovered a hidden evil they had interrupted, a ritual still in motion. They weren't just victims, they were instruments. Mary's fingers trembled as she traced the carvings lining the chamber floor. They weren't decorative. They were musical notations, lines, marks, and ancient symbols arranged in a perfect acoustic pattern. It hit Jonathan all at once. The chapel wasn't built to honour the dead. It was designed to play them. Every moan, scream, and whispered prayer had been embedded into the very architecture. The altar above was a speaker. The congregation had unknowingly been absorbing centuries of suffering, layered beneath the organ's notes and the preacher's sermons. That's why people changed after visiting. Why confessions turned manic. Why no one who lived near the chapel ever truly slept. The dead weren't resting, they were rehearsing. And tonight's arrival, Jonathan and Mary, wasn't an accident. The pulpit stone began to vibrate again. Not from movement, but from activation. The preacher with the sewn mouth raised his hand, and the ear-lined wall began to hum in perfect pitch. A crescendo built not of voices, but of memory. They weren't in a church. They were in a requiem, one written in blood, and they had just become part of the finale. You don't leave Hollow Creek. You echo through it. As Jonathan turned to flee, the exit collapsed in a silent implosion, not with noise, but with absence of vacuum of sound so complete it rang in his bones. Mary screamed, but no voice came out. The air had thickened into something unnatural, something aware. The walls pulsed like lungs, absorbing breath and memory. The hymns carved into the stone began to bleed, literal lines of dark red trailing through ancient grooves, dripping onto the floor, where names shimmered in the fluid. His name was among them, Jonathan's, etched long before he was born. That's when he understood he hadn't discovered the chapel by accident. He had been called, predicted, written into the score. A generation must return every cycle to keep the song alive, to fuel it. The people of Hollow Creek didn't bury their dead, they recorded them. And the living was simply the next track. As the preacher lowered his hand and the walls erupted in one final, layered cry, Jonathan felt his voice split from his throat, rising, not in panic, but in harmony. The chapel didn't kill, it composed. Not every disappearance is a tragedy, some are orchestrated performances. In the months after Hollow Creek fell silent, the town above whispered only rumours. The chapel sealed itself shut, its doors fused like melted wax. The organ inside playing a single sustained note no one could trace. No bodies were found. No rescue teams returned. But strange things began to happen. Radios caught fragments of weeping in static. Old hymnals rearranged themselves. And at exactly 3:17 a.m. each Sunday, the ground beneath the church pulsed like a heartbeat. Locals say the chapel breathes now not in metaphor, but in rhythm. Every Sunday at dawn, a low hum radiates from beneath the floorboards of the abandoned church like an engine of sorrow restarting itself. Animals refuse to cross the threshold. GPS fails within 200 feet. And those who dare approach say their thoughts aren't their own. They think in voices that aren't theirs, remembering memories they never lived. A boy wandered too close last fall and returned hours later speaking fluent Latin, a language he'd never studied, reciting phrases found nowhere but in the chapel's oldest ledger. His eyes stayed fixed for 3 weeks. Farmers near the ridge claim the soil has soured, crops refusing to root, as if the land itself is rejecting growth. One woman claimed her father buried 14 years ago whispered her name through the walls of her cellar, repeating it with choir-like precision. And on stormy nights, when thunder rolls across Hollow Creek, A final chorus echoes faintly from underground, a sound not quite human, not quite gone. In the aftermath, silence became the loudest sound in Hollow Creek. The townspeople stopped speaking of the chapel not out of healing, but out of fear that saying its name would invite it back. Police reports vanished, journalists who visited never published, and families who lived within a mile of the church moved away without listing their homes. One house sold for $1, its buyer gone by nightfall. Trees near the chapel now grow in spirals, twisting upward like corkscrews, as if reaching for something unseen. The local river, once clear and shallow, runs black every equinox, and no scientist can explain why. What's worse, dreams have changed. Those who lived nearby report identical nightmares, the sound of choir children humming underground, of stone grinding against stone, of footsteps that pause but never retreat. And Jonathan, he was never found. But every year on the day he vanished, his voicemail rings once at 3:17 a.m, then stops. No trace, no voice, just a soft echoing breath on the line, like something, still waiting, still listening. The town may look the same on the surface, but something beneath Hollow Creek has changed permanently. Children born after Jonathan's disappearance refuse to enter the woods, claiming the dirt whispers back. Local dogs avoid the chapel's path entirely, growling at shadows no one else can see. Power outages spike every year on the same date. Cell service collapses near the site. Even satellite phones go dead. Residents report hearing a chorus with no source, always low, always just out of reach like a lullaby meant to paralyze. Tourists who venture too close return disoriented, some vomiting black sludge, others unable to recall their own names for days. A geologist once tried to scan beneath the chapel's foundation. His equipment fried instantly. When he returned home, he carved a single phrase into his basement wall before vanishing. It was never buried. It was waiting. And now, that waiting feels active, like something has shifted into place. Whatever Jonathan uncovered, whatever truths the town tried to silence, they're no longer content to be forgotten. They're rising, breath by breath, through the cracks. Years later, the property was quietly sold to an out-of-state investor who claimed he didn't believe in town folklore. Within a week of breaking ground to redevelop the area, his lead contractor fell through a sinkhole that hadn't existed the day before his body never recovered. Construction halted indefinitely when multiple workers complained of identical hallucinations, a figure standing at the chapel's doorway, eyes hollow, hands dripping with what looked like ink. One man walked off the site mid-shift, muttering, "I heard my own mother, and she's been dead for years." Paranormal investigators flocked in, drawn by online whispers of a living curse. They broadcasted one live stream before abandoning the series altogether. Their final frame showed dozens of children's handprints pressed against the chapel glass from the inside. None of them ever returned to Hollow Creek. One left a cryptic review online. There's no story to tell. There's only something that tells you. Since then, no one dares enter the chapel grounds after sunset. Even the bravest don't pretend to be fearless. They just hope it's not watching. To this day, no one truly knows how many voices were lost beneath the chapel's rotting floorboards. How many names erased before they could ever be spoken aloud. Locals whisper that the earth remembers what people choose to forget, and that's why dogs refuse to walk past the fence line. Why radios crackle with static when tuned near the site. Why children born in Hollow Creek still wake up screaming at 3:33 a. Claiming they saw a girl with no face standing at the foot of their bed. Every year, the town holds a harvest festival, but they never invite the press. Never open the chapel gates. A plaque was installed near the ruins, supposedly for safety reasons. But those who read it closely notice something strange. The names carved into the stone shift ever so slightly when the sun sets, as if the dead are still trying to speak. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a stain, a wound, a history that didn't just happen but continues to echo. And if you ever find yourself near Hollow Creek, remember this: some places aren't haunted because people died there. They're haunted because no one ever listened. The scariest part of this story isn't the creaking chapel floors, the shifting names, or the faceless girl at the foot of the bed. It's the silence, the complicity, the way a town chose comfort over truth and buried its shame beneath rotting wood and whispered prayers. What haunts us most are the things we refuse to confront, because what we don't face, we repeat. So ask yourself, what stories are we ignoring today? Whose voices are we still silencing? If this tale unsettled you, it should. That's how you know it's real. And if it made you think, even for a second, then let it linger. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your hometown held a secret like this? Hit save so you don't forget what unearthed truths feel like. And if you want to keep digging into the chilling corners of history, subscribe now, because the next story might be buried right beneath your feet.